right now, the smaller bone in your lower leg is basically perfectly shaped to replace your jaw.
It really is.
And like a piece of your small intestine happens to be the exact diameter needed to rebuild your throat, which is just wild to think about. Today, we're taking a deep dive into what is honestly the ultimate human jigsaw puzzle.
That's a great way to put it.
Because, when you picture surgery, you probably imagine like a few stitches or maybe a localized repair. But the procedures we're exploring today, head and neck reconstruction, they are entirely different.
Completely different ballgame.
We're talking about surgeons literally rebuilding the human face and throat from scratch. And they're doing it using your own body as a catalog of spare parts.
It is. I mean, it's a masterclass in human engineering. Truly.
Yeah.
We are looking at this fascinating evolution of surgical techniques here.
Right.
We're going to trace how this is done, starting from what are known as regional pedicle flaps, and then moving up to the incredibly high stakes of microvascular free flaps.
Which sounds intense.
Oh, it is. And finally, we'll explore the totally bizarre biology of bone and tissue grafts. So, for everyone listening, if you were to visualize this, imagine the backdrop transforming right now into this gallery of classical anatomical sketches.
Oh, like Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man.
Exactly. Picture that, like layered over with modern, high-tech surgical blueprints. It's art, biology, and mechanics just completely intertwined.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because, we're not talking about shaving off a little skin from the thigh to cover a burn.
No.
We're talking about shifting massive sections of bone, muscle, and even digestive organs from one end of your body and plugging them into your head.
It's a massive undertaking.
Yeah, and the most foundational way to move all that tissue is something the sources call a regional pedicled flap.
That's right. So the core concept of a pedicle flap is that you're moving a block of tissue, and that can be skin, fat, muscle, or all three.
Okay.
You move it to a new location to cover a massive wound or defect. But here's the critical rule. You are keeping its original blood supply completely intact.
Meaning you don't cut the blood vessels.
Exactly. You never sever the main artery and vein that feed that specific block of muscle.
See, that makes me think of like a tethered spacewalk.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. You have the astronaut, which is the tissue being moved, and they're floating out to do a job. But that astronaut can only go as far as the air hose or the blood vessel allow.
They're physically anchored to their starting point.
Yeah, they're anchored. But wait, if I need to rebuild a nose or a jaw, I can't exactly stretch a chest muscle all the way up the face without it looking like a giant bulky strap.
You really can't.
So why even use a tether? Like, why not just detach it and put it exactly where you need it?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the tether is actually their greatest strength in certain environments. Moving tissue without disconnecting plumbing is incredibly reliable.
Oh, because it's guaranteed to have blood flow.
Exactly. It requires much shorter operating times, and you totally bypass the need for microscopic vessel reconnection. But the real answer to your question comes down to the disaster zone we're moving that tissue into.
The disaster zone.
Yeah, these tethered flaps are absolute lifesavers for patients who have heavily irradiated or traumatized tissue in their head or neck.
Because the local blood vessels in a traumatized neck are basically just fried.
Precisely. If someone has undergone extensive radiation therapy for, say, throat cancer, the radiation actually damages the DNA of the blood vessels.
Wait, it damages the DNA?
Yeah, it causes microscopic scarring. So the local blood supply becomes incredibly tenuous. If you just drop a completely disconnected piece of tissue into that environment and try to hook it up, it'll likely die.
Because the plumbing you're connecting it to is faulty.
Right. But a pedicled flap brings its own highly reliable, fully functioning blood supply with it from way outside the irradiated zone. It's exactly like running a heavy-duty extension cord from a working outlet in the living room.
Into a kitchen where all the wiring is totally melted.
Yes. Perfect way to visualize it.
That paints a really clear picture. And looking at the reconstructive playbook in our sources, there's one major workhorse here, which is the pectoralis major flap.
The chest muscle.
Yeah, the chest muscle. Surgeons can apparently swing a piece of your chest muscle all the way up to the lateral canthus, which is, well, that's the outer corner of your eye.
It is a profoundly versatile tool. It really is. It's heavily relied upon because it's a one-stage procedure. It's highly vascularized, and you can even take a piece of the fifth rib with it.
If you need bone, right?
Right, if you need bone to rebuild a lower jaw. Right. But because it includes both the muscle and the overlying chest skin, it comes with some highly unusual biological quirks.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Especially when you're using that chest skin to recreate the wet mucosal lining inside the mouth or throat.
Yes, right. And this is the detail that actually grossed me out a bit.
It's definitely memorable.
If you use chest skin to rebuild the inside of a patient's mouth, there is a very real potential for hair transfer because the skin doesn't magically know it's in a mouth now. It still thinks it's on the chest. So it can literally grow chest hair inside the oral cavity.
I know. It is definitely a jarring reality of the procedure.
I cannot even imagine having to manage that as a patient.
It's tough. But you have to remember, when the alternative is a massive, unclosable defect in the oral cavity that's exposing the brain or major neck arteries.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It is a functional trade-off that simply has to be made. Of course, the cosmetic aspect is the only drawback. You're permanently sacrificing the function of the donor muscle.
Right, the muscle you move.
Yeah. If a surgeon uses the trapezius from the upper back or the latissimus dorsi from the side, the patient faces genuine shoulder weakness.
Because you move the muscle that lifts the arm.
You're literally detaching the biological engine that lifts the arm just to close a wound on the head.
So you solve a life-threatening problem on the face, but you create a permanent structural deficit in the shoulder. And you are always limited by the physical length of that blood vessel tether. Which begs the question, what do you do when the tether simply isn't long enough?
Right.
Or when swinging a massive chest muscle up the neck is just, too bulky for the delicate contours of the face.
Well, that is the exact threshold where reconstructive surgeons have to cut the cord entirely.
Okay, here we go.
And that takes us into the high-stakes world of microvascular free flaps. This is where the tissue is completely detached from the body.
Fully disconnected.
Fully. The surgeon severs the artery and the vein, physically carries the tissue across the operating room, and then painstakingly reconnects those tiny blood vessels under a high-powered microscope.
To a completely new blood supply in the neck.
Exactly.
I mean, just conceptualizing this, it's like ripping out the plumbing of a house, driving it across town, and perfectly reconnecting the pipes before the water pressure builds up and ruins the drywall.
That's a very stressful but very accurate analogy.
It sounds insanely risky. I mean, wait, how often does this actually fail? Because if you're sewing together vessels the size of a spaghetti noodle by hand, surely things go wrong constantly.
You would naturally assume the failure rate would be astronomical, honestly. But the reality of modern microsurgery is staggering. The failure rate is actually less than 5%.
Less than 5%?
Yes.
That honestly feels impossible for something so delicate.
It's an incredible engineering triumph. However, achieving that low failure rate demands intense, round-the-clock monitoring.
Like in the ICU.
Yes. If a failure is going to happen, it almost always occurs within the first 24 to 72 hours. So the surgical team has to be vigilant in identifying exactly what kind of plumbing failure is developed.
So what are they looking for?
They're constantly checking the flap's color, its temperature, and its turgor.
Wait, turgor, do you mean like how swollen or stiff the tissue feels?
Exactly. The physical tension and bounce of the tissue. They even use a 25 gauge needle to prick the flap to see how it bleeds.
Just poke it with a needle.
Yep. They are diagnosing the specific vascular bottleneck. If it's an arterial failure, meaning the fresh oxygenated blood simply isn't getting into the flap, the tissue will look terribly pale.
Right, no blood.
Right. And a needle prick won't yield any bright red blood. But interestingly, a venous failure is actually much more common.
Venous failure. So the blood gets in through the artery, but it can't get out through the vein.
Exactly.
Why is that more common?
Well, veins have much thinner walls than arteries, and the blood flows through them at a much lower pressure. This makes them significantly more prone to kinking or twisting or developing clot if it's controlled.
Oh, that makes sense. They're flimsier.
Very much so. If the vein blocks, the flap turns a congested, bruised purple color, and a needle prick produces copious amounts of dark, deoxygenated blood.
Yikes.
If that happens, it's a surgical emergency. The team has a roughly 50% salvage rate if they rush the patient immediately back to the OR and manually clear the connection before the tissue suffocates.
Suffocates. Man, that brings up the terrifying reality of these procedures, which is the ischemia countdown.
The ticking clock.
Yeah. Once you cut that tissue away from its original blood supply, a biological clock starts ticking. It's like holding your breath underwater. You can only go so long before permanent brain damage sets in.
Exactly.
And the time limits for these tissues are incredibly stretched.
Yes, and what's vital to understand is that the tolerance for oxygen deprivation varies wildly depending on the metabolic rate of the tissue you're moving.
Okay, like how fast it burns energy.
Right. If you're moving a piece of the jejunum, which is the small intestine, surgeons only have about 2 hours of what we call warm ischemia time to get it reconnected.
Because the intestine is basically sprinting, right? It burns through its oxygen reserves incredibly fast.
Precisely. The intestinal lining is constantly turning over cells and requires massive amounts of energy. Skin and fat, on the other hand, are more like they're resting.
So they last longer.
Much longer. A purely cutaneous flap, so just skin and fat, can survive for about 8 hours disconnected.
Oh, wow. 8 hours versus 2.
Yeah. Skeletal flaps involving bone sit right in the middle at roughly 6 hours.
It is a literal race against the clock. And the surgical ingenuity required to actually reconnect those vessels under that kind of pressure is mind-blowing.
It's an art form.
Seriously. And here's where it gets really interesting for me. Okay, so if you're taking a tiny blood vessel from my arm and attaching it to a major artery in my neck, the sizes won't match up.
Very rarely do they match.
Right. The neck opening might be way bigger. Doesn't the blood flow just bottleneck and clot if you try to stretch a small pipe over a big one?
That is a critical fluid dynamics problem. If you simply stretch a tiny vessel, you create turbulence. And turbulence in blood causes immediate clotting.
Which is exactly what you don't want.
Right. So when there's a size mismatch, say the opening of the neck artery is more than twice as wide as the arm vessel, surgeons use a brilliant technique called fish melting.
Fish melting. That sounds weird, but I'm guessing it involves slicing it open.
Exactly. They take the smaller blood vessel and slice a tiny longitudinal wedge straight down into the end of it.
Like splitting the end of a straw.
Yes. They essentially open the circular pipe up into a wider oval with a fish opening its mouth. This dramatically increases the circumference of the opening without stretching the delicate tissue.
Oh, that's clever.
It allows the surgeon to stitch that newly widened opening completely flush against the much larger vessel. So it creates this smooth, watertight funnel that completely avoids any kinking or blood turbulence.
So, okay, what does this all mean for the patient? We've established the plumbing miracles required to pull this off, but the actual spare parts catalog they're pulling from is wild.
It really is a catalog.
Yeah, where exactly do we get a new jaw or a new throat?
Well, let's look at the jaw first, because recreating the complex angles of a human mandible is structurally demanding.
I imagine.
The premier choice is the fibula flap. They take the smaller of the two bones in your lower leg.
The fibula, they just take a bone out of your leg. How does the patient not just immediately collapse when they try to walk?
Because the human skeleton has built-in redundancies. The thicker bone in your shin, the tibia, actually bears the vast majority of the body weight.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So you can safely harvest the fibula with surprisingly little impact on how the patient walks. And the fibula provides an absolute abundance of material, up to 40 centimeters of consistent straight bone.
40 centimeters.
Yes. Surgeons literally take that leg bone, make precise wedge cuts into it, and essentially fold it to perfectly mimic the angled contours of a jawline.
Up to 40 centimeters. That is easily enough to replace the entire lower jaw from ear to ear.
It is. And because it's a free flap, they don't just take the bone. They take the surrounding blood vessels, and they can even take a specific sensory nerve from the leg with it.
Wait, a nerve?
A nerve. When they stitch that leg nerve into a separate facial nerve, they can actually give the patient feeling back in their newly reconstructed jaw.
That is unreal. Bone from the leg rewired into the face, so you can actually feel your own jaw again.
Biology is amazing.
It really is. And what about the throat? We mentioned that sprinting 2-hour countdown earlier.
Right, so for replacing the esophagus or repairing massive defects in the pharynx, they turn to a visceral flap, the jejunum, a segment of the small intestine.
Which sounds extreme, but I guess the structural logic is sound. It's basically the exact same tubular diameter as the human throat.
Anatomically, it is uniquely suited for the job. But crucially, the cellular makeup of the jejunum actually handles targeted radiation therapy remarkably well.
Oh, which is vital since most throat reconstructions follow cancer treatments.
Exactly. However, the jejunum comes wrapped in something called the serosa.
Serosa.
Yeah.
Is that like a slippery outer coating?
Yes, exactly. It's a smooth membrane that prevents your internal organs from sticking together.
Makes sense. You don't want your intestines tangling up.
Right, but in the neck, that slippery serosa means the surrounding neck tissues will never adhere to it, and they will never grow new secondary blood vessels into it.
Oh, I see the problem.
Yeah, it will forever, for the rest of the patient's life, rely entirely on that single microscopic vascular connection the surgeon performs on day one.
Talk about high stakes. No backup systems allowed.
None at all.
Now, while the leg and the intestine are amazing, the sources note that the most frequently used free flap for head and neck reconstruction actually comes from the arm.
Yes, the radial forearm flap.
Right.
It is the absolute go-to for soft tissue. It provides very thin, pliable, hairless skin on a remarkably long vascular cavity.
So no chest hair in the mouth with this one.
Correct. It is perfect for recreating the tongue, the floor of the mouth, or intricate facial defects, but it requires permanently sacrificing a major artery in the arm, the radial artery.
And this is where the procedure hinges on something you, the listener, can actually test on yourself right now.
Oh yeah, the Allen's test.
Yes. To ensure the patient's hand won't simply die when the surgeon seals its main artery, they require this low-tech physiological safeguard called the Allen's test. And I want to walk you through exactly how this works.
It's a very cool test.
So if you hold your hand up, the doctor finds the two main arteries in your wrist, the radial artery on your thumb side and the ulnar artery on your pinky side. They press down hard on both, totally cutting off the blood flow.
Right.
Then you clench and unclench your fist a few times to physically pump all the existing blood out of your hand.
At that point, your hand will look completely pale, almost white, because there's zero fresh blood entering.
Exactly. Then the crucial moment. The doctor keeps holding down the radial artery, the one they want to seal for the surgery, but they let go of the ulnar artery. If color rushes back into your hand in under 10 seconds, you pass the test.
Right. What that test proves is the health of your collateral circulation. Yeah. The human hand has a natural built-in backup generator loop called the palmar arch, which connects those two wrist arteries.
Yep.
So the Allen's test safely proves that your backup loop is fully functional. It guarantees that the ulnar artery alone can keep the entire hand perfectly alive before the surgeon unplugs the main power source on the radial side.
I love how physical and immediate that is. You can literally just see it happen.
Yeah.
Now, there's one detail regarding moving the soft tissue that completely caught me off guard.
Oh?
Yeah. When surgeons move muscle to rebuild a sunken cheek or a jaw, the tissue doesn't stay the same size.
No, it absolutely does not. And this is a massive insight for reconstructive planning. Here is the cruel irony of using muscle.
Okay.
Once you move it to the face, even if you hook the blood supply up perfectly, it inevitably shrinks. It actually atrophies down to just 20% of its original mass.
Wait, 20%, it loses 80% of its volume.
Yes.
Why? If the plumbing is perfect, shouldn't it stay healthy?
Well, it stays alive, but it doesn't stay bulky. Muscle tissue requires active, heavy mechanical load to maintain its volume.
Like lifting weights.
Exactly. The actin and myosin proteins inside the muscle fibers literally break down if they aren't working hard. When you take a chest or back muscle that evolved to hold massive arm weights and simply lay it over a jawbone, it is no longer experiencing any functional tension.
So it just gives up.
Basically, it undergoes profound permanent atrophy. A reconstructed cheek might look perfectly full on day one, but 6 months later, it will be totally hollowed out.
So how do you get around that if you need permanent volume to make a face look like a face?
You have to rely on fat. Vascularized fat only reduces to about 40 to 60% of its original mass.
Oh, because it doesn't need to work out.
Right. It doesn't rely on mechanical tension to maintain its physical structure. So selecting a flap isn't just about what covers the whole today. It's about aggressively calculating the biological degradation of that specific tissue years into the future.
It's biological chess. You really have to think 5 moves ahead.
You do.
But let's round out the reconstructive toolkit here. We've talked about pedicle tethers and the intense microvascular plumbing of free flaps. But what if we don't have the time or the ability to hook up the blood vessels at all?
Right. Sometimes that's the case.
So like, what if you just need a small structural scaffold?
That is where we transition from flaps to grafts.
Grafts, okay.
The fundamental difference here is that a graft is completely severed from its blood supply. There's no pedicle, and there's absolutely no microscopic reconnection of vessels.
Nothing.
The living tissue is harvested, moved, and placed into the defect entirely disconnected.
Man, it is the ultimate leap of faith. It's like planting a seed in the ground without installing a sprinkler system and just crossing your fingers that the surrounding soil is damp enough to keep it alive.
That's a perfect analogy.
But how does a graft not just immediately die of starvation?
It survives strictly on the mechanism of nutrient diffusion. For the first few crucial days, the graft acts almost exactly like a sponge.
A sponge?
Yeah. It absorbs oxygen and vital nutrients directly from the ambient plasma and fluid cooling in the underlying wound bed.
Just soaking it up.
Just soaking it up. So it's entirely dependent on the health of the tissue it's resting on until a process called neovascularization kicks in.
Neovascularization, so new blood vessels.
Exactly. Microscopic new capillaries slowly grow from the wound bed up into the graft to finally reestablish a permanent blood supply.
That makes the actual placement so critical. And I want to dive into how this works with bone grafts specifically.
Okay.
Because if you take a piece of the hip bone and graft it into the face without hooking up the vessels, the timeline for that bone to actually heal and become structural is intense.
It is a highly orchestrated biological process called osteogenesis, and it happens in very distinct phases.
Right.
For the first month, you have the osteoid formation phase. This is driven by osteoblast cells found in the spongy, cancellous part of the bone graft.
Cancellous, you mean the honeycomb-looking interior of the bone?
Yes, exactly. That honeycomb interior is rich with living cells. Those transplanted cells survive via diffusion and immediately start laying down an initial, highly fragile framework of uncalcified bone.
Okay, so it's a weak framework at first.
Right, but that's just the scaffolding.
Then the heavy lifting starts.
Exactly. Then the remodeling phase really takes over. I like to think of this as a construction site. You have a complex interplay between the demolition crew, which are osteoclast cells, clearing away the dead, disconnected bone from the graft, and the bricklayers, the osteoblast cells, building strong, permanent new bone in its place.
That's amazing.
And the foreman directing all this work are bone morphogenic proteins, or BMPs. These are powerful growth factors housed in the hard, outer cortical shell of the graft that actively recruit patients' native stem cells to join the construction effort.
But for any of this delicate cellular construction to actually work, the sources mentioned there are two absolute non-negotiable requirements for bone grafts.
Yes, there are. The first is strict, absolute immobility for 8 to 12 weeks.
No moving at all.
None. If there is even microscopic wiggling between the graft and the recipient bone, the body essentially gives up on trying to build a rigid bone bridge. Instead, it fills the gap with flexible, fibrous scar tissue.
Oh, so it just patches it poorly.
Yeah, it's called a fibrous union, and structurally the graft is completely failed.
Okay, what's the second requirement?
The second is strict, flush, bone-to-bone contact. The cells building the new bone cannot magically jump across an empty gap. The graft has to sit perfectly flush against the living, bleeding bone.
Which brings us to one of my favorite details in this entire deep dive.
Oh, the exception.
Yes, it's a massive contradiction. Bone-to-bone contact is an absolute law of physics for survival, except for two specific types of bone in the face.
Right.
The nasoseptal bone and the turbinate bone inside the nose.
Yes. The sources explicitly note that for some uncertain, honestly unexplained reason, grafts made from those specific nasal bones do not require direct bone-to-bone contact to survive.
It's so weird.
It is. You can seemingly place them into soft tissue, and they somehow maintain their integrity. They completely defy the standard rules of osteogenesis that govern literally every other bone in the human skeleton.
I just love that. Even in this incredibly precise, heavily engineered medical field, the body still holds on to a few mysteries. It just does what it wants.
It really does.
Yeah.
You know, if we connect this to the bigger picture, that mystery perfectly encapsulates what we're really looking at here.
How so?
Well, through these reconstructive techniques, we aren't just learning surgical mechanics. We are seeing a profound demonstration of the human body as an endlessly adaptable modular machine.
A modular machine.
Yeah, from the reliable extension cords of pedicle flaps to the microscopic plumbing of free flaps to the raw diffusion-fed survival of bone grafts. We are quite literally the sum of our adaptable parts.
It really changes how you look at yourself. I mean, for you listening, you look down at your own forearm or your lower leg, or you think about a piece of your chest muscle and you realize they aren't just arms and legs.
No, they're not.
They are a biological toolkit, perfectly packaged and waiting to be utilized if the worst happens. Which leaves you with a truly wild thought to ponder long after we finish here today.
Let's hear it.
If a piece of your leg can be physically moved and rewired to become your jaw, and a piece of your intestine can become your throat, completely abandoning its original purpose to learn an entirely new function,
Yeah.
how much of our physical identity is actually tied to the location of our body parts versus the sheer miraculous adaptability of the living tissue itself?